Hello everyone, my name is José Couto, and I'm happy to be presenting my research titled Techno-Experimental and Functional Approach to the Lesmas of the Itaparica Tradition, Central Brazil, Serranópolis. This research was completed during my master's in prehistory at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona in cooperation with the Milá Fontanals Institute, CSIC, with the guidance of Drs. Antoni Palomo, Juan, José, Ibáñez, and Ignacio Clemente. Enjoy! To begin this presentation, I will provide a brief introduction to the Itaparica tradition, followed by our research objectives and rationale. It's especially nice to be back with a follow-up of my last presentation titled The Slugs of the Itaparica Tradition, an Experimental Approach, where I present the technological reproduction of the Lesmas that we use on this current research. Well, the Itaparica tradition is an important archaeological culture marking the earliest widespread human settlements in Brazil and potentially extending into other regions of South America. Spanning approximately from 12,700 to 7,400 years BP, the Itaparica tradition represents a significant hunter-gatherer culture and technological phase during the transition from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene in Brazil. Within the red circle is Serranópolis, located in the southwestern region of the state of Goiás. It's one of the most significant areas associated with the Itaparica tradition and the current reference point for our experimental research. The map you see highlights with black dots the distribution of archaeological sites featuring unifacially napped tools or lesmas dated earlier than 8000 BP. Although bifacial tools were also produced, the Itaparicas are best known for its distinctive unifacial lithic artifacts, particularly the lesma. This research primarily stems from the need to deepen our understanding of the functional aspect of the lesmas, and use-ware analysis or traceology is an appropriate methodological approach for this purpose. However, to achieve meaningful results, it is essential to follow a systematic approach. A critical step in this process involves developing an extensive use-ware reference collection. This collection will enable comparative analysis with archaeological specimens, which is particularly important since the silicified sandstone under investigation differs significantly from flint and possesses distinctive characteristics regarding use-ware traces. Therefore, this research represents the initial step towards establishing such a reference framework. An approach integrating experimental archaeology with use-ware analysis was implemented, drawing specifically from literature and terminology related to non-flint raw materials. The protocol consisted of 4 stages. First, the formulation of hypotheses regarding tool hafting. Second, the documentation of tools prior to experimentation using macro photography and high magnification microscopy. Third, the hafting of tools, followed by their use in various tasks, and finally, detailed documentation and analysis of the use-ware traces resulting from these tasks. Here are the lesmas produced by the first experimental protocol mentioned earlier, and used in this experiment, each accompanied by its identification number for systematic reference. So, about the hafting hypothesis, the existing literature on this topic is quite limited, yet, through analysis of available archaeological evidence and comparative studies, we've formulated innovative hypotheses concerning how these tools may have been hafted. Schmitz contributed to our understanding by suggesting that these tools were hafted, basing his assessment on macroscopic observations such as differential use-ware patterns. He also observed that various lesmas exhibited standardized removals at their bases, areas typically associated with prehensive strategies. Further evidence for hafting comes from Lourdeau, who identified patterns of tool breakage, specifically a high ratio of fractured to intact lesmas, as indicative of hafting. So, drawing on all these references, we developed a couple of hafting hypotheses based on Strodor classification. Two methods stood out for us: elbow or angled hafting and axial hafting, both making use of the tool's flat ventral side for juxtaposition. Now moving on to the second step, the pre-experiment lithic surfaces documentation. So, before any experimental use, documenting the original condition of the tools is essential to identify and interpret use-wear patterns accurately later on. Our documentation began with a macroscopic examination of key areas of the Lesmas, primarily the cutting edges and potential hafting zones, where we expected to observe use-wear post-experiment. For this, we used the Hirox RH2000 digital microscope. Next, we conducted a detailed micro-level observation using a metallographic microscope, the Leica DM2500. Images were taken at 200x and 400x magnification. We focused on identifying the two main components of the raw material: the quartz grains, or crystals, and the intercrystalline matrix. At high magnifications, quartz grains appear sharply defined against the matrix. We also noted that unifacial flaking produces a sharp edge with minimal damage in its unused state. To complement the surface analysis, we also use silicon molding to capture high-resolution details of apical and lateral edges and potential hafting areas. After the surface documentation, we moved on to the actual hafting of the Lesmas. For the hafting, we used dried Robinia pseudacacia as the primary handle material, selected for its strength and durability. To firmly attach the lithic pieces to the handles, we utilized leather strips as the primary binding method. These leather strips were tightly wrapped from the base to approximately the middle of the tool. The absence of adhesives facilitated easy blade replacement. Additionally, small wooden wedges were strategically placed between the ventral face of the tools and the hafting platform to minimize unwanted movement during use. This method significantly enhanced stability, improving force transmission and precision during handling. So, after thoroughly documenting the tools, we move into one of the key parts of our experimental work, actually using the Lesmas in controlled tasks. As part of our experimental program, we conducted a series of controlled tests with each Lesma tool, using them for at least 60 minutes on a variety of materials, including animal hides, wood, antler, and meat. For hide processing, we carried out 6 experiments focused on hide treatment, using Lesmas numbered 1 through 6. Fresh hides from roe deer were processed using Lesmas with axial haft in juxtaposition. The tools demonstrated excellent grip and control. 2 gestures were recorded: scraping at approximately 80 degrees and cutting at around 30 degrees. The combined use of these techniques allowed for thorough membrane and fat removal within 4 hours. Dry hides included both untreated and ochre-treated samples from wild boar and roe deer. The ochre hide required additional effort, but tools performed efficiently, with tool number 5 used freehand, showing particularly effective scraping when used laterally. For woodworking, Lesmas 7 and 8 were used on fresh holm oak branches of 10 cm in diameter. Lesmas 7 was mounted with a 60-degree elbow haft and used for thrown percussion successfully, cutting through the branch after just over an hour of repeated strikes. Despite some chipping at the ventral apical area, the tool proved highly effective. Lesmas 8, with an axial haft, was used to debark and scrape the previously cut piece of oak using lateral motions at 80 degrees. The scraping focused more on the tool's edges and demonstrated high efficiency, offering excellent control and versatility. For the antler working, we used the Lesmas number 9, grip with the leather wrap. The tool was used with a sawing motion at 80 degrees, but was unable to cut through the full diameter of the antler within the hour. Finally, for the butchery, Two Lesmas, 10 and 11, were used freehand to process pork rib sections. Results. Following the experimental phase, we enter now on what we consider the core of this study, the analysis of useware traces generated through our protocol. This stage was divided into macroscopic and microscopic documentation conducted both before and after cleaning the tools. Macroscopic observations before cleaning. Significant macroscopic traces were identified on tools used with ochre, hardwood, and deer antler. In these cases, we observed clear edge rounding, residue accumulation, and edge breakage, particularly in the mesodistal and apical regions. Scraping wood left compacted residues, while working antler generated finer, more compact residues. Fresh hides with ochre resulted in a paste-like residue that coated not just the edges but settled deeply into the surface topography, including flake scars and depressions. Apical areas, especially on tools used for trompe percussion, showed large flake removals and residue accumulation. The microscopic observations. For consistency in our terminology, especially when describing non-flint raw materials where patterns, such is the case, we have based our analytical vocabulary primarily on three key references: Clemente, Pederngrana, and Sussman. Using two metallographic microscopes, the Leica DM2500 and the Olympus BX-FM, we recorded micro-wear patterns at 200 and 400x magnifications. For dry hide, we identified partial corrosion of quartz grains and matrix beginning from crystal edges inward. Short smooth striations created by microfragments of the edge displaced along the ventral face. We documented also a kinetic pattern reflecting scraping gestures at low angles. For the fresh hide, we observed shallow flake scars, light rounding, and mixed striations. The polish was limited, but still distinguishable on matrix and crystal surfaces. On the other hand, fresh hide with ochre produced a well-developed abrasive polish across the entire edge and a remarkable rounding of the edge. We also observed distinctive furrow-like striations associated with bidirectional movement. For the dry hide with ochre, it produced the most advanced wear observed, marked by extensive corrosion, well-developed polish, and loss of distinction between the matrix and the crystals. For the woodworking trompe percussion, despite heavy edge damage, the use developed microstriations and pitting along the apical edge. And it was the only tool with definitive hafting wear, visible as corrosion and pitting. For the woodworking scraping, it caused intense rounding and microflaking across the mesodistal edge, along with semicircular flake scars and developed polish on the matrix elevated microtopology. For the antler cutting, we observe a widespread edge fracturing due to the hardness of the material. But despite constant fracturing, we documented incipient polishing, fine striation, and partial crystal corrosion. Finally, for the butchery, it generated minimal wear, only light edge rounding, occasional microflaking, and slight internal edge polish. Well, in the end, we were quite happy with the experimentation. The wear patterns observed were task-dependent, reflecting the hardness of the materials and the gestures employed. We documented the progression from abrasive polishing, like in ochre-treated hides, to fracture-driven edge modification, like in antler and wood, and identified distinctive patterns of striations, corrosions, polish, and pitting tied to each activity. To conclude, we would like to remind that this study only marks the first step in building a dedicated reference collection for silicified sandstone tailored to the Itaparica context. These results will be crucial for supporting future useware analysis of Lesmas from Itaparica sites of Brazil, so stay tuned for future progress on this matter. Thank you very much for listening e muito obrigado a todos. Tchau!